Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for May 1st, 2018. On today's show, we're going to go into the spoiler room, and we're going to discuss some questions we have about Avengers Infinity War, or at least questions I have. So if you have yet to see the film, you might want to pause this and keep this for a later time. Sorry, this is all that everybody's talking about right now. And we will also talk about some of the reactions, because we have some people on here that were not here on Friday to tell us about their thoughts on the film. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Sciretta, and joining me on today's podcast is Senior Writer Ben Pearson.
Hey, what's up?
Writers Hoai-Tran.
Hey, everyone.
And Chris Evangelista.
Hi.
Okay, guys, let's just get into it. Again, spoilers for Avengers Infinity War. I have compiled a list of questions here that just came to me over the weekend. I wanted to see what you guys thought. Actually, before we get to the questions, let's get to your reactions, because HT, you've been away at the Tribeca Film Festival. I have not heard your thoughts on Avengers Infinity War. What did you think?
So, I really enjoyed Avengers Infinity War in the moment, and there were a lot of great moments in Infinity War, and I feel like that was a lot of what Infinity War was. It felt like a collection of really compelling, really jaw-dropping moments that, made me cheer, made me cry, made me laugh. Well, maybe not made me cry. They were so fun to watch.
Peter Parker didn't make you cry? Like, I had some tears.
I didn't cry. And it was very strange to me, because I cry a lot during movies. And for some reason, a lot of the emotion in this film sort of rang a little hollow for me. And I wonder if it was just because the movie was so jam-packed. It didn't have room for the emotional moments to breathe. But I felt like, even though I love these characters and I know these characters and have been with them for a while, it just felt like kind of a series of cool moments after the other without a moment for the story and the characters to just, stay with those moments, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But, it was fine. It was a really enjoyable blockbuster film, but it felt to me almost like it had to happen. I was watching it, and it didn't feel like a movie unto itself as much as just everything has been building up to these specific character moments and these specific fan service worthy moments that were really exciting to watch with a huge crowd. But I'm not really sure how much rewatch value it really has, or whether it stands alone as a film. But in the end, I thought it was solid, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. And I actually really admired the way that the Russo brothers structured this film, because they were juggling so many characters, and I felt like each of the characters mostly had their time to shine, except for maybe Cap's team back on Earth. But we did get, some sort of full character arcs and a surprising amount of depth coming from Thanos, which was really surprising to me. And I actually did find the more emotional moments coming from Thanos' backstory and Thanos' and Josh Brolin's motion capture acting from behind Thanos, which I was really impressed with. But yeah, it was I would say it was a mixed bag for me. It wasn't something that I think stayed with me as much as Black Panther did, or as even Thor Ragnarok did.
I can say this much. I've seen it a second time, and I think it does grow on you a little bit, seeing it subsequent times. But Chris, you were not on our podcast on Friday. You wrote this big spoiler review on the site, calling it a partially successful blockbuster. What did you think of the movie, and what was the best and worst parts of it?
For the most part, I liked it. It was an entertaining film. It also felt like half of a movie to me, which I guess it really is, because part 4 is essentially going to be, Infinity War Part 2. It really felt like, to me, it felt like the film was really just starting to get going at the very end. And I actually, as everyone was starting to disintegrate, I actually thought there was still a half hour left in the film. So I wasn't quite caught off guard. I was like, oh, this is fine. They're gonna figure it out sooner or later. But they Yeah, so it caught me off guard. Can you hear my dog barking?
Yes. Yes.
Sorry.
It did remind me a little bit of Game of Thrones. Now, stay with me, guys. Game of Thrones, I'm not a big fan of Game of Thrones. I know other people on this podcast love it. But I think like every episode there's 10, 20 minutes at the end that are awesome, and the rest of it is all these factions that are split apart and we're cutting between them, all these different families and things, and throughout the season you're waiting for everything to come together in a big epic way in the end. And I feel like in this movie they almost don't come together. Actually, they don't, right? All the characters do not collide. We interestingly don't even see Steve Rogers and Iron Man back together since the events of Civil War by the end of this movie. So it's actually interesting in that way. What is your favorite and least favorite parts of this movie?
My favorite is really, I'd say, just the humor. There's a lot of good humor in the film. Mostly anything involving the Guardians of the Galaxy I really liked. I mean, the Guardians of the Galaxy films are my personal favorite MCU films, both 1 and 2. And so anytime the film focused on them, I really just sort of was really, really into it. It was funny. And adding Thor to the mix was a great choice too, because, as Ragnarok showed, Thor has become sort of the funniest Avenger. So he worked really well in that environment.
Aside from it being the first part of a two-parter, which I can see people thinking that as a negative, what would you say the biggest problem with the film is?
I didn't really think any of the action was coherent. I know I'm in the minority here, but I don't really think the Russo brothers are good action directors. I think they're very good at drama. They're very good at the comedic moments because they're from a comedic background. I don't think they're very good at directing action, which is strange because they've been, handed the keys to the MCU kingdom here, which is very action driven. But I tend to think they shoot a lot of action very close up, very blurry, and it's almost.
See, but I usually like that. I like what they did with Winter Soldier, and that airport sequence in Civil War was just fantastically character driven action. That seemed like it was probably all animatic out, years in advance of shooting. But I'm in agreement with you on this film. There wasn't an action scene that I'm like, I need to go see that action scene again.
Yeah, exactly. And I felt like for a movie like this, it should have had a big show-stopping action sequence, and I really don't think it had that. I mean, I guess the ending, in Wakanda is sort of big, and but even that just felt very. I don't know. It felt like stuff I had seen in a dozen different movies before. I wanted something just a little bit new. But again, let me just underline this before people write into the podcast and say, "Get that guy off the air. He hates everything." I didn't hate this movie. I thought it was pretty good. So please do not accuse me of hating this movie.
Yeah. Ben, we already heard your brief reaction on Friday, but you wrote up this piece on the site. Avengers: Infinity War is about emotional terrorism. I'm wondering if you could give us the gist on that. What does that mean?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about this, and I think the idea of actual, traditional terrorism has been something that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has really used as a plot point since its very beginning. The opening scene of Iron Man begins with a caravan being bombed, and that is what sort of kicks off this whole thing and really, leads Tony Stark to become Iron Man. So 10 years later, the idea of the MCU transitioning more from traditional acts of terror, which are more like existential threats, to something that I called emotional terrorism, which is basically a threat that's far more personal, was sort of interesting to me. So I wrote this piece about it, and it really boils down to this movie putting all of its characters, or a lot of its characters, into almost impossible decisions that they have to make, often between a loved one, the survival of a loved one on one hand, or the survival of a universe on the other hand, and how the different characters react to that choice, and how they, stand and become heroic in the face of these really really heart-wrenching decisions that they have to make. So you can read more about that there, but yeah, that's essentially the gist of the piece.
I'm wondering your thoughts on. I know I was listening to David Chen. He recorded a video cast with his wife, and he had a big problem with the idea that the Avengers wouldn't sacrifice that one life for, half the universe. Do you know what I mean? That that could have prevented everything from not happening. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I think that Scarlet Witch did sacrifice that one life. She's the one who actually was able to pull it off. And then Thanos, in one of, I think, the most cruel acts in the entire movie, uses the Time Stone to undo her decision. I mean, that is I have not given a crap about Scarlet Witch and Vision in any of the upcoming movie or the preceding movies, but the way that this story concentrated on Elizabeth Olsen's Wanda Maximoff and Paul Bettany's Vision in this movie really actually almost kind of tricked me into caring about their relationship, because they did such a good job of putting letting her do a lot of the heavy lifting there, and it all builds to the scene where she has to kill Vision in order to prevent Thanos from getting the Mind Stone, and she actually does it. I mean, she's in love with this guy, or android, or whatever you want to call him, and she has to obliterate him of her own free will in order to save the universe, and Thanos rips that away from her by reversing time and then taking it anyway. And then Peter Quill and Gamora have sort of a similar situation when I think they're on Nowhere and Thanos captures Gamora. And right before this, we see this sequence where Gamora convinces Quill to kill her if Thanos ever takes her hostage. And it's this really heartbreaking moment where they're standing there eye to eye and they know what has to be done. They profess their love to each other, and Quill pulls the trigger. He actually would have done it had Thanos not used the Reality Stone to turn his laser blast into worthless bubbles. So,
I wonder if the prop master had to build a version of that blaster that actually produces bubbles, or if that was just a completely CG effect.
Yeah, I don't know. That would be funny. So yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't seen David's video review yet, so I'm not sure if he talks about all the Avengers, but I think at least two of them, or at least two of the major Marvel characters. I don't know if you could call Star-Lord an Avenger yet, but the two of them actually, try to go through with it. So I think they make the tough choice in an effort to save the universe, but Thanos isn't having it, basically.
They make it too late is the problem. Although, with the Time Stone at the end, is there a too late? I don't know.
Right.
But actually, one of our writers, Vanessa Armstrong, went and sat through a 30-hour marathon of the Marvel films leading up to Avengers Infinity War. And I was hanging out with her this weekend, her and her husband, and she mentioned that Elizabeth Olsen's accent throughout the movies gets less and less, and in
Right.
Infinity War it's not as deep as it was in her introduction in Ultron, which I thought was an interesting observation coming from someone who sat in a seat for 30 hours and watched most of the Marvel movies leading up to this. But okay, so guys, I've now that we've gone through some reactions and stuff, I do have some questions for you. This is something I was thinking of. I know, HT, you are a big fan of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Yes.
Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? What?
Although I will admit I have not watched most of this season.
Okay. Why is that?
I just kind of dropped off, and I was not as interested in this sort of plot line which took them far into the future, which might actually answer the question that you have that you're about to ask.
That is the question I have, because the Marvel television series are really not that connected with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Jeff Loeb runs the TV and Kevin Feige runs the movies, and they don't work together that well or that often. Traditionally, the things that happen in the movies aren't even referenced in the TV show. So I was wondering, how is Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. going to ignore the events of that Infinity War twist?
Yeah, Captain America Winter Soldier played a huge part in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Early season, and it kind of helped sort of revamp the show to become the better series that it is now. But it ever since then and ever since Thor: The Dark World, the references to the MCU have been getting more and more minimal until like the biggest reference they had to Doctor Strange wasn't even a reference, just some sort of like a plot line that was vaguely magic related. But the most recent season sort of took them on this it's been very like time jumping. They at the beginning of the season, the team got pushed all the way to hundreds of years in the future, in which I'm going to say some spoilers for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. The world has been destroyed, and the rest of humanity is living in this space station, essentially, and it's enslaved by the Kree. And this is only one of the potential futures, I think. So this is the S.H.I.E.L.D. team is kind of brought to try to maybe stop this future or help the people in the future at some point. Though I do think, I was kind of reading up on this before this episode, that they end up going back to their current time. And as of now, they're in some sort of massive bunker named the Lighthouse. And there was like a small reference to events happening in New York in the last episode, which may have been tied to the beginning of Avengers Infinity War. But if the next few episodes are like kind of run concurrently with the events of Infinity War, then we may finally see what actually happens. But as of now, since they're in this sort of massive bunker that has the ability to shield them from apocalyptic or alien attack, they might just like avoid it altogether or not learn about the events until after the fact, because I think there was some sort of little plot twist in which they accidentally set off some sort of alarm and shut themselves in this bunker for like the time being. So they might just like actually shield themselves from the events of the end of Infinity War.
Interesting. I don't know. It would be. I feel like there's no way to avoid this. I mean, there was no way to avoid the, S.H.I.E.L.D. basically. What do you call it? Splitting up, I guess.
Yeah, like disintegrating essentially.
Yeah. Okay, so another question I had for you guys is, I saw some people on Twitter complaining about spoilers, as they often do, and they were complaining that some sites were running, headlines on Peter Dinklage's Avengers Infinity War character revealed, right? And it didn't say anything about what the character was in the headline, but people were angry that headline spoiled the fact that there was a cameo appearance from Peter Dinklage in the movie. Is this a spoiler? I thought his casting was announced, 2 years ago.
This is definitely not a spoiler. His name is on the poster, so the big group shot poster where they're all standing around. At the very bottom, there's a list of cast members, and his name is there. So there's no way that's a spoiler. So anyone complaining about that is being a bit silly.
Okay, let's move on to our next one. I think you've answered that quite fully, and that is, at the end of this movie, when people start disappearing, being erased from this universe, some of the last two people are Spider-Man and Black Panther, and we actually got a couple emails with people like questioning if they did not follow movie news as well, then they would have had a better experience because they wouldn't know that there's another Spider-Man movie in the works, that there's another Black Panther movie in the works, which I think is just ridiculous to argue for, to not have that knowledge. But I'm wondering if you guys, because when I was in the movie and coming out of the movie thinking about this, I was like, oh, obviously, they're going to have to correct this universe because they have these movies coming up. But do you think that those characters were intentionally erased last to kind of like give that hint to audiences? I almost feel like, when Spider-Man disappears, you got to kind of ask yourself, oh, they're not going to make any more Spider-Man movies? Oh, like if I'm just a general, audience goer that is not following movie news, like that kind of like gives me hope that, there's going to be more to this story. What do you guys think?
I don't know. I feel like it would be hard to argue the hypotheticals of in this alternate world where we never knew any of the movie news and Marvel kept a tight lid on all of the contracts, then maybe this would have worked better. And I don't really know about like I think that maybe Spider-Man and Black Panther were left last because they're the newest characters that we have the most emotional resonance with. And even Spider-Man gets like this sort of long goodbye scene that no one else gets, which I think kind of milked it a little bit. But yeah, what was the question again? Sorry, I kind of like.
Well, no, I'm wondering if you think, do you think it was intentional by Marvel Studios to put those two people last to kind of signal to general audiences that, like, you know, this is crazy that this is happening, but, like, you know, they could have kept Spider-Man and Black Panther alive, right? They could have been the half of the universe that could have survived it, and then it would have looked more devastating that, like, it would have seemed less people coming out of the theater having the idea of, like, oh, they have to correct that somehow.
Right. That's where I think the emotional stakes of this movie sort of fail, because we know that this can't be a lasting consequence. We know that the good guys will win at the end. This is an Avengers movie, and that we know that these guys have so many movies ahead of them. So it does ring sort of false because you're like, oh, well, obviously they're not going to disappear for good. And I wonder if they had kept them, then maybe would it have felt more like the stakes felt real? So that's a good question, actually. But yeah, and also the fact that they introduced at the beginning of the movie a gauntlet that can reverse time and bring back things. So I wonder how much of an impact it would have had overall, even if we had kept Black Panther and Spider-Man, just because we already have like a Deus Ex Machina waiting for us.
Ben, Chris, do you have any thoughts on this?
What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, in my review, I actually point this out, that one of the problems I had with the film is that it's hard to get too emotional about, you know, everyone quote unquote dying for this very reason. You know, not just Spider-Man, but literally all the Guardians of the Galaxy except Rocket disappear. And we already know they're making Guardians 3. So what, is the third movie just going to be Rocket? Like, that's not going to happen. So,
well, and plus, Nebula too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So, but, I feel like part of the problem I had with the film is it does tip its hand a little bit onto how the next film is going to remedy everything. Like, not only do, you know, we know these characters are going to come back, but there's that whole sequence where Doctor Strange, you know, he meditates and he sees millions and millions of different options on, you know, how the outcome of the battle is going to be. And he says, you know, there's only one outcome where we win. And then immediately after this, he gives Thanos that last stone, which is basically like a wink at the audience saying, oh, this is how I know eventually we're going to win. I'm setting these events in motion. So, you know, I know why that stuff is in the movie to set up the next film, but it bugged me a little bit that it just felt like it was too much winking at the audience to let them know that, you know, don't get too upset. We're going to undo all of this.
Yeah, I think intellectually I agree with all of what both of you just said, but I still was really moved by that Spider-Man moment. Like, in spite of myself, in spite of the knowledge that I have about the future of this franchise, and basically like the common sense business aspect of, like, yeah, of course they're going to keep making Spider-Man movies. But I think, Peter, to your question, I think that's probably you know, it works on three different kinds of audiences, right? There's us, the people who follow the stuff very, very closely, and it was sort of a surprise to us that Black Panther and Spider-Man were gone because of what we've been talking about. We assumed that the movie would sort of play the game, so to speak, where they would keep them alive and kill off somebody like Captain America or Iron Man, these more vintage legacy characters. And then it works also for people who go in and just see some of the Marvel movies who have no idea that these other films are even in production at all or will be, you know, the people who basically go into the theater and only know about new movies from the trailers that play in that screening, you know. So I think for those people it probably did have a lot of impact because they just don't really think beyond the movie that they're in the theater to see on that given day. And then there's like the people who are more in between, who maybe started out as like the group that I just mentioned, but then as soon as you walk out of the theater, they think about it a little bit more and realize that, like, oh yeah, Marvel's not going to leave money on the table by never making a sequel to Black Panther. Of course, Black Panther is probably going to come back. So yeah, I think it works sort of across the spectrum.
I do have a couple thoughts on this that I want to relay before, Avengers Infinity War talk dies down. And that is, do you think there's a possibility that in Avengers 4, they are able to reverse who is dead and who's alive in this end sequence? In that, I mean, Steve Rogers and Tony Stark would be the ones that have to end up sacrificing themselves to have all the people that had disappeared be alive.
Yeah, that would certainly be a dramatic way to end the movie, and it would provide it with conceivably some legitimate stakes. That's something that I think this movie has been knocked for because of what we've been talking about. We know that it's going to resolve itself somehow, but what if that resolution involves the actual final sacrifice of a lot of these other characters in order to save the others? Yeah, that's a good way for them to actually make it mean something, I think. And
another thing I wanted to bring up is Spider-Man, Peter Parker's last moments. He's there kind of like shaking for like an extended period of time where other people kind of like just disappear into dust before they realize what's happening. And I've seen people complain about this. To me, I wanted to just express, I could be making this up in my mind. This might not be the intentions of the screenwriters and the filmmakers, but to me, Peter Parker is getting the Spidey sense, knowing what is happening around him in the universe, sensing, this, half the universe getting erased from existence. And that, like, he's not feeling it. Like, he's reacting to that at first before he actually, anybody have any thoughts on that?
That is deeply, deeply nerdy, Peter.
Yes.
I think it's totally possible. Do anything you set your mind to.
Okay, one other thing I wanted to bring up that came out over the weekend is The New Yorker, a critic named Richard Brody published a review. He was not a fan of this movie, but The New Yorker tweeted out a quote from his review that said, "In Avengers Infinity War, characters aren't introduced, they just show up, and their behavior is entirely defined by the template set for them in other movies," unquote. His review kind of goes on to complain that, there's no setup in this movie. It's all elsewhere, like character motivations and, plot, all that stuff. I'm wondering, because, I tweeted out that, basically calling it stupid on Twitter. A bunch of people got upset with me because, some smart people like Film Crit Hulk, noting that, you go watch Return of the Jedi, and technically, I mean, it would help you if you have seen A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, but you can go into that movie, and the backstory that is in that movie is kind of presented in a way that you could just see that movie as the first movie. Whereas this critic is complaining that this could not be watched as the first movie into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I was curious to hear your thoughts, Chris.
First of all, Richard Brody, even though he's a critic I almost never agree with, he's a very good film critic. He's very smart. He knows a lot about movies. So I don't want to poo-poo him too much, but I will say I do think part of this argument is a little silly, but at the same time, I do think he has somewhat of a point. I do agree that the film is very abrupt in how it gets all the characters into the story. I'm not saying the film needed to, stop and reintroduce us all to all these characters again, because that would be insane. There's just too many characters to do that. But I do think it could have been handled just a little bit better. But I also feel like he's approaching this in a different sort of way. He's approaching it not the same way that the screenwriters are approaching this sort of storytelling. This is, a very long form sort of storytelling over a period of films. It's more like TV than a movie, really. So, I see where he's coming from. I don't entirely disagree with him, but I also do feel like it's not as huge of an issue as he's making it sound like.
HT, do you think that we have entered a new era of storytelling where, it's more of a serialized TV kind of thing?
Oh, I think we entered that long ago. I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe definitely perfected that, and a lot of other movie franchises are starting to sort of take notice. I will say about this review that I don't entirely disagree with it either. Though I do think Richard Brody takes a sort of condescending tone with the entire MCU. I do think he makes some good points about the sort of serialization of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films and how they do sort of follow like a certain template. You do kind of know what the structure of the story will be. But like, I don't think that's a bad thing overall. I do think that, this movie did feel like a season finale for a really epic TV show. And that's what Marvel has done so well. I mean, the fact that they have gotten consistently good movies for the past 10 years, and they've gotten tons of audiences in for this movie, which requires at least you to watch, for you to watch at least half of the other films, is kind of amazing in that itself. But yeah, he does make good points, but I do think that like you said, the way that he approaches it is a little bit abrasive.
It's interesting that you call it a season or compare it to a season finale of television, because it even has that cliffhanger that most season finales have. Exactly.
I mean, like, it felt, this is kind of a weird comparison, but at some points I felt like I was watching an old episode of Justice League. Like, the Justice League animated series. I was like, oh, this feels like something that was like a set piece out of Justice League Unlimited or something like that, which is not a bad thing to say. It was something that I really enjoyed and kind of invoked this really, this emotion out of me that I felt as a kid in terms of like, what's going to happen next? Where will my favorite characters go? And I think that's what the Marvel Cinematic Universe does so well. But I think as a movie and as a movie critic from Richard Brody's perspective, he has some good points.
Okay, I have one last thing. I know we're going a little bit long here, but I wrote up this article, Avengers Infinity War has a few MCU continuity errors. Let's nitpick them on the site, which you can read now. I will link it in the show notes. I won't go over all of them, but I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of the Infinity Gauntlet, because I think there was an Easter egg in Thor 1, where we saw the Infinity Gauntlet with all the gems in Odin's vault. And by we saw, I mean you have to pause the movie at the exact frame. Do you know what I mean? It's very, very, like, hard to see in the background. It's not something that, like, I think 99% of audience members would see. Marvel addressed this later on with Cate Blanchett's character Hela, basically raiding Odin's vault, and she like sees the Infinity Gauntlet there and throws it to the side, calling it fake, which is a clever way of addressing it, because a lot of fans were like, why is the Infinity Gauntlet there with all the whatever? And that movie basically kind of presents Odin as like the kind of guy that would, make a fake Infinity Gauntlet to scare the Asgardian people and the people of the other worlds into thinking he's more powerful than he is, which is interesting. So okay, this is all a setup for me to ask you, in Infinity War we see Thanos, or we don't see him, but we see the aftermath of him going to that planet where Peter Dinklage's dwarf character is, and him forcing him to make the Infinity Gauntlet. So I'm wondering if this Infinity Gauntlet existed in the MCU, or a version of this Infinity Gauntlet existed in the MCU 10 years ago, when, during the events of Thor 1, how is it that Thanos is just making one now? Like, could there be any possible explanation for this error in continuity?
I don't know. I mean, I was the first thing I was thinking when we were talking about this in our Slack channel earlier was like, maybe he commissioned this years and years ago, because we know that he was working with Loki in the events of the Avengers, which was 6 years ago. So maybe he had the designs of, getting all of these gems early on and just wanted to make sure that his gauntlet was ready for when he finally managed to achieve that. We also know that he's like been frustrated this whole time because he wanted to have these Infinity Stones way sooner than he eventually got them. So yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question.
It's also strange because, there's this end title sequence on Age of Ultron that features Thanos basically pulling the gauntlet out of like some kind of vault and putting it on his hand and saying, fine, I'll take care of this myself. And by himself, he means the Dark Order and his kids. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. I remember asking the writers about this on the set of Infinity War, and they basically, Stephen McFeely said, not our movie. And then Christopher Marcus said, and we've all sat there and went, what the hell is he talking about? Where was he when he did that? Which is kind of funny.
Didn't we have a discussion a while ago that was talking about how the end credit scenes aren't technically canonical? I felt like we talked about this.
I think that was brought up in our Slack channel. I'm wondering, that's where I was leading this too. Do you take the end credit scenes to be canonical? Because I mean, obviously that's where we first saw Thanos. That is, there is bits of information. There's obviously that scene from it was in Ant-Man, but it was for Captain America: Civil War that was at the end of the credits. So that's obviously from the movie that's canonical. Ben, are end credit scenes in these Marvel movies canonical?
Yeah, we definitely talked about this in an episode of the podcast as well, and I think I think it's sort of like on a case by case basis. That may be the consensus that we came to. I don't recall if that was just my thought or if that's what everybody agreed on. But yeah, I think like in the examples that you just mentioned, there are some that are clearly that fall perfectly in canon, and then there are others like that Ultron one that the writers are like, what the hell is this? It's just sort of like I think it's like a spot for each filmmaker to add their own little touch to things, and in the earlier movies it made sense because it was more like laying the foundation for the characters that we like Thor's hammer showing up in the New Mexico desert and stuff like that. It was like a direct tease for the following movie. And since the Guardians movies, especially Guardians Volume 2, really just sort of like got crazy with their post-credit scenes. I think there were like 6 post-credit scenes in that movie. It's just sort of like an extra playground for them to do whatever they want in, and then Marvel can go in and retcon the events of those a lot easier than they can retcon something that actually happened within the body of the film.
And it's actually kind of crazy if you rewatch the first Avengers film, the Joss Whedon Avengers film, that Thanos end credit scene kind of suggests that Thanos' motives in this whole thing is to rule Earth. And like the other guy there says, the humankind is unrulable, So I don't know. It just seems like we give Marvel a lot of credit for this long-term story planning, which I give them a lot of credit, but it's just interesting how much evolution they do along the way, almost like a TV series, like how Lost started out as one thing and became another. And these aren't things that I necessarily really have a problem with. I just thought there were like nitpicks that I came up with. There's also like a little bit of a change in Gamora's backstory. You can read about it on the site. I think we're already going long, but I'd be interested to hear what you guys think of that. Send us emails, peter@slashfilm.com, or you can comment in the comments on the site as well. And that does it for today's edition of Slash Film Daily. HT, where can people find more of your work online?
You can find me every day at slashfilm.com, and I'm on Twitter at HTranBuoy.
Ben, where can people find more of your work?
You can find me writing at Slash Film as well. You can find me on Twitter at Ben Pears.
Chris, where can I find you?
Also Slash Film on Twitter at Evangelista413.
You can find me at Slash Film on Twitter, slashfilm.com. All the stories we talked about today linked in the show notes and on slashfilm.com. You can subscribe to this podcast, published every weekday on iTunes, Google Play, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please, if you have a question, comment, concern, send it to us at peter@slashfilm.com. And please go rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends, spread the word. We'll see you tomorrow.